And welcome back again, everyone. This video today is going to be part 6 in my series on eschatology and the Doctrine of Eternal Torment. And in this one, we're going to be continuing our discussion on Matthew 24 and some of the issues surrounding its proper interpretation. And while I don't want to lose sight of why the correct interpretation of this chapter is so important and how it ultimately relates to the doctrine of eternal torment and the final state of the lost, I've got a lot of material I want to try and cover today. So rather than go back over a lot of that older ground, I'm just going to highly recommend that you check out the previous videos in this series, and I'll put a link to the playlist down in the description. So just a really quick reminder of where we left off in the previous video. I've shown how Matthew 24 opens with Jesus' prediction that the temple would be destroyed. The disciples asked Jesus 2 questions, one about when the temple would be destroyed, and one about his coming, or in the Greek, parousia. So the chapter contains 2 questions and 2 answers from Jesus. And Jesus' answers present us with 2 prophetic horizons, and the contrast between the 2. The time of the first horizon, which deals with the question of when the temple would be destroyed, is known. Jesus states that those events would be fulfilled within the space of 1 generation. The timing of that second future prophetic horizon dealing with his parousia is unknown, and I suggested that all the confusion trying to properly interpret this chapter arises from applying events which Jesus appears to consign to that first known past horizon to the second unknown and yet future horizon. So today I want to try and do a couple of things. There are prophetic events described in Matthew 24, mostly in verses 15 through 34, events which Jesus appears to consign to that past fulfilled horizon, which are almost universally thought to be descriptions of Jesus' parousia or second coming, that still future horizon. And I want to show why I believe that it's a mistake to apply those events to that future prophetic horizon. I believe it can be shown that the events described in those verses actually found a precise fulfillment within that past first century generation. In fact, I believe it can be shown that a consistent interpretation of Matthew 24 actually demands a first century fulfillment of those events. Next, I hope to show that Jesus' reference to this generation was in fact a reference to the time in which those events would occur, and that any other interpretation of those words is, well, let's just say, extremely unlikely. Now, Matthew 24, verses 15 through 34 contain many prophetic concepts, such as the Abomination of Desolation, the Great Tribulation, and in fact, Jesus coming in the clouds with power and great glory, things which are commonly and widely associated with Jesus' parousia or future second coming. So how is it that I can say that those things were precisely fulfilled in the first century and belong to that past first century prophetic horizon? Well, the first thing we need to highlight is that Jesus' reference to this generation not passing until all these things be fulfilled in verse 34, well, that statement doesn't stand on its own, but is actually the climax of a long chain of temporal or time-related statements, which begin all the way back in verse 15, in answer to the disciples' question of when the temple would be destroyed. And this is something that's easy to miss, but it's incredibly important for how we're going to interpret this section of Jesus' prophecy. So let's just take a look at those time statements and how they fit into a particular tightly connected chain of events. And first, I'm just going to go through these quickly to show just how these time statements are linked together, and then we'll come back afterwards and look at the details. So notice this chain of time or temporal related statements. It starts in verse 3, the disciples' question of when the temple would be destroyed. Then at verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. Notice that word when is a marker of time. Verse 16, then flee. When, then, again a marker of time. Verse 19, woe unto them in those days. That would be those fleeing in verse 16. Verse 21, for then there shall be great tribulation. Verse 22, except those days be shortened, and that those days would be shortened. Notice how those days are linked to what has preceded this. Verse 23, then, if any man says to you, here is Christ, etc. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, again linking it back to what's previously been said. Verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes shall mourn. Again, markers of time. Verses 32 to 33, when you see all these things, all those things that preceded it, know that it's near. Again, a marker of time. Then we come down finally to verse 34. This generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. Now, I don't think anyone can deny that these verses and the temporal references to time which we find in them form a tightly connected chain ending in verse 34 with Jesus' statement that this generation shall not pass away. And it's because of the way these verses are connected by these temporal statements of time, those when and then statements, that it's extremely difficult to see how Jesus' reference to that generation in verse 34 could be anything other than a prediction of when those events would occur. This entire sequence, beginning from verse 15, is given by Jesus to warn and instruct his disciples. So if verse 34 isn't a reference to time, that is, if it wasn't supposed to be understood as telling the disciples when those events would occur, then it seems to me that the verse would be completely out of place. And just to illustrate what I mean here, some have suggested that by this generation here, Jesus meant a specific type of person. That is, that the Jewish people as a collective, ongoing, unbelieving generation would not pass away. That is, they would remain in a collective state of unbelief until all the previous things mentioned by Jesus had been fulfilled. And some have suggested other similar interpretations, such as that Jesus meant the Jewish people in general would not pass away. And some have even suggested that Jesus meant that the human race wouldn't pass away. Now, admittedly, race or type is one legitimate definition of the Greek word geneia, or generation. But that's not the question here. The question is whether or not any of those types of interpretation make any sense in this context. And to me, interpretations such as those seem completely divorced from and offer no guidance whatsoever to the disciples' question, which began the entire discourse, the question of when the temple would be destroyed. That question of when, in verse 3, is followed by a discourse full of temporal statements of time, including when and then. But then here in verse 34, at the climax of his answer, Jesus suddenly shifts to speaking not about the timing of events, as he had just been doing, but of a particular type of person. It just doesn't seem to fit this context. And it just doesn't even seem to make much sense. The entire discourse appears in the context of predicting national judgment on the Jewish people, which would involve the destruction of the temple and the desolation of their nation. What insight is actually offered by a statement that a particular type of person destined for those judgments would be around to experience them until those judgments were finished. The disciples weren't asking about the unbelieving condition of their fellow Jews, or about how long any race, type, or group of people, Jewish or otherwise, would remain in a certain condition. Their question was about when certain events would occur. So it's difficult to place an interpretation on Jesus' words about this generation in verse 34, which turns his words into an answer to a question he was never asked. So this is the first point I need to stress. Jesus' words that this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled in verse 34 is the summary and climax statement, first to the disciples' question of when, and then to the series of events in verses 15 through 33, which are full of statements about when certain things would occur. And it seems less than plausible that Jesus' reference to this generation should suddenly be a reference to something other than the time in which those things would happen. And I think we're going to find that this will only become more obvious as we continue. So now let's look at some of the details contained in that chain of events from verses 15 through 34. Verses 15 through 34 contain this series of tightly connected statements of time. And that series begins in verse 15 with Jesus' statement, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now this chain beginning in verse 15 actually gives us an advantage in interpreting the entire chapter, because if we can identify that first event in the chain, what Jesus meant by the abomination of desolation, then we know that everything which follows is sequentially and tightly bound to that first event. And here, I believe Scripture and history provides us with an undeniable answer, and one so clear that there's no need to veer off into wild speculation as to the question of what this abomination of desolation is in verse 15, and when it was to occur. As I've noted in a previous video, parallel accounts of Jesus' prophecy here in Matthew 24 can also be found in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. And it's by comparing these parallel accounts that we can know what Jesus meant by the abomination of desolation here, or at least the specific time in which the abomination of desolation was to appear, and under what circumstances. Now, while I won't go into a detailed comparison of the two chapters, I think it's undeniable that Luke 21:20 through 21 is a direct parallel to Matthew 24:15 through 16. So let's look at those two passages together. In Matthew 24:15 through 16 we read, When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. And in Luke 21:20 through 21 we have, And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, I don't think there should be any question that these two passages are precise parallels, and that the one, Luke chapter 21, explains the language of the other in Matthew chapter 24. And I would caution against trusting any system of interpretation which tries to break the obvious parallel between these two passages. What we have here in comparing these two passages is an explanation of Jesus' words concerning the abomination of desolation. What Jesus calls the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15 is paralleled with, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the desolation is near, in Luke 21. Notice that connection. Matthew, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee to the mountains. Luke, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the desolation is near. Flee to the mountains. Now, just as there should be no question that these passages are supposed to be understood together, there should be no question about precisely when this prediction was fulfilled. The surrounding of Jerusalem by armies, which resulted in the destruction of the temple and the desolation of the nation, took place in the 1st century when the Romans besieged the city in 70 AD. And again, I would caution against trusting any system of interpretation which tries to ignore or sidestep that these verses are referring to that historical event, as though these verses could be speaking of some future surrounding of Jerusalem by armies. Remember the entire context of this passage. Jesus predicted that the temple, the one standing in the first century, would be destroyed. The disciples asked him when those things would happen. Jesus' words in verse 15 are answering that question, not some other question which has nothing to do with the context. So, that temporal sequence of time events, beginning in verse 15 and climaxing in verse 34 with Jesus' statement about this generation not passing away, that sequence begins with this seminal event, the Abomination of Desolation, or the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies. And we know from history precisely when that prediction was fulfilled. It was fulfilled in the first century when the Romans surrounded and laid siege to Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Now, I know that many Christians believe that the Abomination of Desolation is referring to some future event, but I would just like you to consider how unlikely that is given this context. A prediction about the temple's destruction, the question of when, Jesus' answer that it's near when they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that context firmly anchors the Abomination of Desolation to events which took place in the first century. So, once we've firmly established that first event in the chain of temporal statements beginning in verse 15, what do we have? Verse 15, when you see the Abomination of Desolation, or Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then, verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This chain of events clearly begins in the first century. Verse 19, woe to those in those days. Notice, those days are connected to what Jesus just said. Woe to them in those days, fleeing when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. Verse 21, for then, and notice that statement of time, for then there shall be great tribulation. And folks, here we have a serious choice to make. I know these words, great tribulation, are taken by very many believers to be a prediction of events still to come. But that just isn't what's going on here. Jesus' statement of, then there shall be great tribulation, needs to be understood in this context. He says, then there shall be great tribulation. But the context already told us when that is, when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies and besieged. This statement about the Great Tribulation is bound to a known sequence of events which occurred in history, and there's just no good way to divorce those words from their first century context. And I know that some may think that Jesus' words here about that tribulation being such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time nor ever shall be, that somehow that excludes a first century fulfillment? Well, for now, even though I won't go into a great amount of detail in this video, I'll just point out here that Jesus is quoting Daniel 12 verse 1, and I believe it can be shown that that passage also appears to demand a first century fulfillment, and we'll get into that in a future video. But about this passage here in Matthew 24, R.T. France writes, Josephus's lurid description of the horrors of the siege shows that while verse 21 uses the hyperbolic language of apocalyptic, it is an assessment which would have been agreed by those involved in the events. In passing, we should note that, nor ever will be again, confirms that this passage is about a historical event, not about the end of the world. So, up until this point in our chain of temporal statements, including this Great Tribulation in verse 21, we are still firmly in the first century, during the siege of Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then flee, for then there will be great tribulation. Now verse 22, and except those days had been shortened. Well, Which days? The days of that great tribulation he just spoke of. And on this point, some may question how those words were precisely fulfilled during the first century siege of Jerusalem. And again, I'm going to quote here from R.T. France, who writes, "The horror was in fact cut short by the Roman capture of the city after 5 months, bringing physical relief to those who had survived the famine in the city. But even this natural process of conquest is attributed to the purpose of God to enable his chosen people, or elect, to survive." Even down here to verse 22 and its reference to those days being shortened, and those days are obviously connected to the Great Tribulation in verse 21, to here we're still firmly in the first century and in the context of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 23 through 27. "Then, if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers. Believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming, or parousia, of the Son of Man be." And the first thing to notice here, again, is that opening marker of time. Then, if any man say to you, Here is Christ, etc. The word then once again connects this verse to what preceded it. We're still in the first century, during that siege of Jerusalem, during that time of Great Tribulation. In his work, Antiquities, the first century Jewish historian Josephus describes how the conditions in the city while under siege were fertile ground and gave rise to many messianic pretenders, who sought to establish their authenticity by many signs and wonders. So again, Jesus is not here describing events which to us are still future. Jesus' prediction here was fulfilled exactly when he said it would be. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then there will be great tribulation. Then, if any man say unto you, Here is Christ, don't believe them. Now, verse 27 needs our attention, because it's the only mention of Jesus' parousia in this discourse up until this point. But notice carefully what Jesus says. He warns his followers not to believe those pretenders who say, Look, here is Christ, or he's there. And he draws a sharp contrast between the manner of those events which would occur during the siege of Jerusalem and his parousia. So it's important to notice what's actually going on here. Jesus mentions his parousia here only to contrast it with those things which would be happening during the siege. His parousia will not be like that. His parousia will happen without warning, the way lightning comes without warning, and won't need to be sought for in some secret chamber or out in the desert. The parousia will be unmistakable. Now, in a previous video, I stated that the disciples may have believed that the two events they inquired about, the destruction of the temple and the parousia, would occur at the same time. The entire point of Jesus' words here in verse 27 is to specifically contrast his parousia with the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Jesus will take up the subject of his parousia again, but not until verse 36, and again only by the way of contrast. To the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Jesus gives a precise temporal chain of events in answer to that question. When we come to verse 36 and the subject of the parousia, Jesus emphatically states that the timing of that event cannot be known and will come without warning. Okay then, so back to our chain of events. So far it can be shown that everything which was predicted has been fulfilled in the first century, beginning with the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Roman armies. That would result in a great tribulation. And I'm just going to say, if we stopped here, and this is all that we had, even down as far as verse 27, again, I don't think anyone would be questioning what Jesus meant in verse 34 by "this generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled." I think most would think that Jesus' words in verse 34 were a remarkable prediction, and we had a precise fulfillment of prophecy in history. But it's the material beginning in verse 29 where everything seems to go off the rails. Notice, in verse 29, Jesus states, "immediately after the tribulation of those days." Again, notice those markers of time. And the trouble, if I can call it that, begins here in verse 29 because Jesus follows this statement immediately after the tribulation of those days with words which are almost universally applied to his parousia or second coming. He says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." And it's incredibly important that we notice that the Greek word here for Jesus coming in verse 30 is not that Greek word parousia, but is instead the Greek word erchomai. Now, once again, I need to appeal to your sense of reason and logic. It seems we have only two choices here. Either these words about the cosmic signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and Jesus coming on the clouds with power and great glory, either these things are describing Jesus' parousia, or they're not. Now, if these words are in fact about Jesus' parousia, then given that preceding context, which seems to leave us firmly planted in the first century, and those events surrounding the siege of Jerusalem, events tightly linked together by temporal statements of time, given that, what are our options here, if in fact these words in verses 29 through 31 are descriptions of Jesus' parousia? Well, the first option is that Jesus predicted his parousia in the first century, at the time Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, and that this just is a failed prediction, and Jesus is a false prophet. But of course, that's just nonsense. Jesus is the Son of God and the Word of God made flesh, and the option that Jesus is a false prophet is completely off limits to any believer in God's Word. And I think one could only come to a conclusion that this is a failed prophecy only by completely ignoring the full context of the chapter, or by completely missing the point of Jesus' words here. But we'll come back to that. Okay then, second option. If verses 29 through 31 are about Jesus' parousia, well, we have the full preterist option, that Jesus' parousia did happen back then in the first century. But of course, that means that somehow nearly the entirety of the Christian world for the past 20 centuries, up till this very day, just hasn't realized it. And this is a burden for any advocate of full preterism. If the parousia happened in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, then why did no one seem to realize it at that time, or at any time up until fairly recently? I just don't buy that something as important for the entire creation as Jesus' parousia could have somehow escaped notice, been forgotten, or have been lost to time. Jesus' entire point seems to be that when his parousia does happen, everyone's going to know it. And again, I would call your attention back to verse 27, where Jesus explicitly contrasts his parousia with the events surrounding the destruction of the city and the temple, as well as the marked contrast between verses 34 and 36. So, no, I don't believe at all that the parousia could have taken place in the first century. So for this and other reasons I won't go into right now, I feel the full preterist option is off the table. Okay then, third option. If verses 29 through 30 are describing the parousia, then could they be speaking of events which still await a future fulfillment? A futurist option? And truly, I can relate to those who hold this view. But there's a problem. Those words from Jesus, immediately after the tribulation of those days, well, those days are an echo of what he said in verses 19 and 22. Woe to them who are with child in those days, and except those days be shortened. Those days are clearly about events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. Verse 29 is to take place immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, the only way verses 29 through 30 can be a description of a yet future parousia is to either stretch out that tribulation of those days to include the entirety of the past 20 centuries, or to try and make those days into something other than that which the context seems to demand, those days in the first century. And some try to do this with something like a dual fulfillment theory. So, on that first option, stretching out the tribulation, to my mind that seems nearly impossible. To the contrary, Jesus stated in verse 22 that for the sake of the elect, those days would be shortened. The events of verses 29 through 30 take place immediately after the tribulation of those days, the days that were shortened. It just seems completely untenable to stretch that language, those days will be shortened, and immediately after the tribulation of those days, the shortened ones. It seems untenable that we should somehow understand those days to last a full 20 centuries or more, from the destruction of Jerusalem up until our day and even beyond. And as far as trying to make those days of verse 29 into some other days still future, well, it seems to me that that just is to completely ignore the context and all of the temporal markers which form that tight sequential chain from verse 15 forward. And to be frank, again, it just seems like an ad hoc way of interpreting Scripture in order to try to get around a perceived problem. Now, I'm going to suggest an obvious solution to all this, that Jesus' words in verses 29 through 30 are not about his parousia or future second coming at all, and that all of the difficulty comes down to a misunderstanding on the part of many believers, and the assumption that these verses must be describing Jesus' parousia. I propose that those events were in fact precisely fulfilled just as Jesus predicted, and they were precisely fulfilled when he said they would be, immediately after the tribulation of those days being when Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans, ultimately culminating in the destruction of the temple, the city, and the nation. And I want to suggest that this is actually the most straightforward and obvious interpretation of the text. The only reason many may struggle with this idea is that they fail to properly understand the Old Testament backdrop and context, which is the source of Jesus' language in these verses. But because this video is already getting too long, I'm going to have to leave that Old Testament context for next time, where we'll dig into these Old Testament prophecies Jesus is quoting here. But for now, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. Matthew 24, from verses 15 to 34, all of that material is connected by a tight chain of time and temporal statements about when those events would occur and instructions to those who would experience that time of tribulation. And that chain is not easily broken. And what I've found is that any system of interpretation which tries to break it is only doing so in order to try and salvage the material in verses 29 through 30 and apply that language to Jesus' parousia or future second coming. It can be shown that everything Jesus predicted down to verse 28, including the Abomination of Desolation and the Great Tribulation, was precisely fulfilled within the space of one single generation in the first century. Why should we think that verses 29 through 30 should be an exception? Isn't it at least worth considering that it may be a misunderstanding on our part or a hidden assumption, which is the source of the difficulty? I'm proposing that Jesus' language of when those things would occur can and should be taken at face value, even though we may have to rethink how we've been taught to interpret certain well-known passages. So that's what we're going to do in the next video. Explain how that cosmic language of verses 29 through 30 about the sun being darkened, the stars falling, etc., as well as Jesus coming in the clouds with power and glory, how when considered in context, and in the context of the Old Testament prophecies Jesus was quoting there, how all of that was exactly and precisely fulfilled in the first century. And I do sincerely hope you'll continue to join me on this journey. So, once again, I just want to say thanks to everyone who's taken the time to watch, like, subscribe, comment on, or share these videos. You all have no idea what an encouragement and blessing that's been for me. So if you've also found this video helpful, another like is always appreciated. And if you've not done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. And with that, and for now, once again, this is David with the Harvest Herald, and I hope to talk to you all again real soon in the next video.